Charlie Bennett tilted the brim of his fedora, angling it just so, the gesture almost second nature after years of slipping through the city unnoticed. Tonight, though, his movements felt heavier, burdened by the weight of what lay ahead. His fingers lingered on the edge of the hat for a moment, as if drawing courage from the feel of its worn fabric. It wasn't just a hat. It was a part of his armor, a shield against the city's relentless pull. The brim cast a shadow over his face, blending him into the night, making him just another silhouette on a street that had seen too much and remembered too little. The street lamp above him buzzed faintly, its light flickering like a dying heartbeat. It painted the cracked pavement in an eerie, uneven glow, a reminder that nothing in this city stayed bright for long. A cold breeze wound its way down the street, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the distant tang of cigarette smoke. Somewhere far off, a train horn wailed, a mournful sound that seemed to echo through the narrow alleys and empty boulevards. Charlie stepped off the curb, his polished shoes striking the wet pavement with a resolute click. His coat flared slightly with the movement, the fabric brushing against his legs as he strode forward. Each step felt deliberate, as though he were testing the ground for traps. This city wasn't just a maze of streets and buildings. It was alive, pulsing with secrets and shadows that seemed to shift and stretch in ways that defied logic. It had a way of pulling you in, of wrapping itself around you until you were part of it, lost in its labyrinthine depths. And Laura Sinclair, the city's brightest flame, had been snuffed out by its darkness. Her name lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't quite place, her voice still echoing in the recesses of his memory. Laura wasn't just another singer, she was the singer. The Velvet Veil nightclub had been her stage, and she had commanded it with a presence that left the room breathless. Charlie could still see her there, standing under the soft, golden glow of the stage lights. Her sequined dress sparkled like starlight against a sea of shadowed faces. And then there was her voice, smooth as velvet, rich as aged whiskey, carrying notes that seemed to hang in the air long after the music stopped. The Velvet Veil was a sanctuary of sorts, a refuge for dreamers and drifters seeking solace in the dim light and smoky air. Its walls, stained with years of laughter and heartbreak, had seen everything. But Laura had been its soul. She had the rare ability to make people forget the weight of the world, if only for a few songs. She wasn't just a performer, she was an escape, a promise that beauty could exist even here, in this city of shadows. But now she was gone. Charlie clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The city had taken her, just like it had taken so many before her. He could feel its weight pressing down on him, as though it were alive, watching, waiting. The city had a way of consuming those who dared to shine too brightly. It thrived on their light, snuffing it out and leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. And Laura had been the brightest of them all. He paused under the flickering street lamp, its faint light casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the pavement. His eyes scanned the street ahead, taking in the looming buildings with their darkened windows and the narrow alleys that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The city was a labyrinth, and somewhere in its depths, Laura had disappeared. Charlie's mind raced with questions. Had she been taken against her will, dragged into the shadows by the city's unseen hands? Or had she walked willingly into its depths, lured by some promise or threat? He didn't know, but he intended to find out. Laura wasn't just another name on a missing persons list. She was someone who mattered, someone who had made this city a little less dark. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the heart of the city, his footsteps echoing against the walls of empty buildings. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the silence growing heavier with each step. This wasn't just about finding Laura, it was about defying the city itself, about proving that it couldn't take everything and everyone without consequence. He thought of her smile, the way it lit up a room, the way it had made him believe, if only for a moment, that there was still something worth fighting for in this place. He thought of her laughter, a sound so rare and pure that it had felt like a gift. And he thought of her songs, the way they seemed to reach into the deepest parts of him, pulling out memories and emotions he had thought long buried. The velvet veil felt like a distant memory now, its warmth and light overshadowed by the cold, unfeeling city that surrounded him. But Charlie wasn't ready to let go of Laura's light. He wasn't ready to let the city win. Adjusting his fedora once more, he straightened his coat and stepped into the darkness, his resolve as unyielding as the night was vast. Somewhere out there, the city was hiding its secrets. And Charlie Bennett was determined to uncover every last one of them. Laura didn't just sing, Charlie muttered under his breath, the words slipping out in a bitter exhale, his breath fogging in the cold, damp air. The night around him seemed to listen, the silence almost tangible as it stretched across the empty street. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze fixed on the shadows ahead. She told the truth through melodies, he continued, his voice soft yet charged with a heavy weight, as if the words themselves carried a burden that only he understood. Charlie's mind wandered back to those nights at the Velvet Veil, the way Laura's voice had wrapped around him, pulling him into a world where everything felt clear and raw. She didn't just sing the words. No, that would have been too easy. Anyone could memorize lyrics, could belt out a tune in perfect pitch. But Laura? She gave something more. Every note, every pause, every trembling quiver in her voice was an unspoken confession, a revelation of parts of herself she couldn't, or wouldn't, speak aloud. Her voice had a way of reaching places that words alone could never touch. It was as though she had the ability to hold a mirror up to the soul and make you see things you'd been trying to ignore. She could take a simple melody, something as familiar as the echo of a heartbeat, and twist it until it cut straight through the noise of the world. When Laura sang, there was no pretending, no hiding behind a smile or a glass of bourbon. She bared her soul, and in doing so, made you face yours. Charlie remembered the first time he'd heard her perform a song she'd written herself, her voice trembling at the edges of the melody. The lyrics were sparse, but they were enough to break your heart if you weren't careful. It wasn't just a song, it was a revelation. She spoke of love lost, of secrets buried so deep they could never be unearthed, of dreams that slipped through your fingers like water. She told the story of a life worn down by the weight of its own secrets, and yet there was a beauty in it, a fragile grace in the way she offered up her pain. "I'm telling you," Charlie muttered again, more to himself now, his mind reeling. She didn't just sing. She laid bare everything. And everyone who listened, they felt it. They understood her in a way that words couldn't make sense of. As he spoke, a memory surfaced. A quiet night after her performance, when the air in the club had been thick with the remnants of her voice, hanging in the rafters like an unanswered question. The audience had been motionless, almost reverent, as if waiting for the right moment to exhale. He had caught her looking out at the crowd, her eyes searching, as if seeking something she could never quite find. She had known deep down that her voice was a gift, but also a curse. It was a truth she couldn't keep hidden, no matter how hard she tried. The city had taken so much from her. Her youth, her dreams, her laughter. But it hadn't been able to take her voice. At least not yet. The world she'd created with her music was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the suffocating grip of the city and just be. And in that sanctuary, she had invited others to join her, offering them a glimpse of something real, something that existed beyond the chaos and noise of everyday life. Charlie clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tight. She made them feel things, he whispered, his voice low but sharp, as if the very act of remembering could cut through the numbness that had settled over him. Things they didn't even know they were hiding inside themselves. In those moments when she sang, when the music soared and dipped with the raw emotion of her soul, Laura hadn't just been telling stories. She had been unraveling the hidden truths of the world, one note at a time. She had been the keeper of a sacred language, one that spoke directly to the heart, bypassing the mind entirely. It was a language no one could ignore, no one could fake. When Laura sang, you couldn't escape the truth, your own or hers. Charlie paused, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, a sense of urgency gnawing at him. She wasn't just a singer, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. She was the voice of everything we were too afraid to say. And that's why they took her. Because the city, it can't stand the truth. It can't stand when someone shines too brightly. And now, as he stood in the stillness of the night, he could feel the weight of those truths pressing down on him, and he knew that he couldn't let it go. He wouldn't let the city erase her, bury her under the weight of its darkness. Not when she had given so much. Not when her voice had given him a reason to believe that, maybe, just maybe, there was something worth saving in this world after all. With that thought, Charlie pushed forward, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to stop until he found her. Because Laura Sinclair hadn't just sung. She had set the world on fire with the truth, and now it was his turn to fan the flames. A faint creak of a door sliced through the thick silence, sharp and sudden. The sound was so subtle, it could have easily been lost in the rustle of wind against the trash-strewn street or the distant hum of the city, but Charlie heard it like a bell ringing in the dead of night. Instinctively, his hand moved to the grip of his coat, a subtle but familiar motion. His gaze snapped toward the source, and there, as if she had materialized from the very shadows of the city, stood Effie Fontaine. The neon sign above the diner flickered in its erratic, impatient glow, and it caught the dark auburn of Effie's hair, turning it to copper fire for a brief second before it sank back into the dim glow of the night. Her silhouette against the soft, buzzing lights was almost ethereal, but Charlie knew better. Effie wasn't one to stand in the background of anything. She was always in the thick of it, pulling strings, connecting dots, and making her mark. That's why, even in moments like this, when the weight of the case, of Laura's disappearance, was nearly suffocating him, she never failed to show up. She leaned lazily against the doorway, one booted foot propped up against the threshold, as if she had all the time in the world to let Charlie stew in his thoughts. But Effie knew him too well. She knew how quickly the cracks in his mind began to show when he got lost in a case, how the lines between obsession and responsibility blurred until there was no clear distinction. So, she kept herself visible, an anchor, even as she teased. "You're brooding again, Charlie." Effie's voice cut through the night air, rich with that dry, familiar humor, a quip that wasn't quite playful but held just enough bite to remind him of who she was. It wasn't the first time she'd caught him in the middle of his spiral, nor would it be the last. "It's never just a murder with you. It's a poem waiting to be solved." Charlie didn't immediately respond. He let her words hang in the air, each one echoing back to him in a way that felt just a little too true. There was something in the way she said it that made him pause. Was she mocking him? Of course she was. Effie had a way of making everything sound as if it were a game. But Charlie had known her long enough to understand that beneath her playful sarcasm lay a keen perception that was sharper than most of the knives he'd encountered in the darker parts of the city. He exhaled sharply, the breath more out of frustration than anything else, but there was a shift, an unspoken understanding that began to settle between them. His gaze lingered on her, on the way the harsh neon light reflected in her eyes, the slight tilt of her head as if she were waiting for something more from him. Charlie wasn't ready to explain everything to her just yet. Not until he had pieced together more of the puzzle that had been haunting his every thought. But Effie was already dissecting him, just as she always did. "You're right, Effie," he muttered finally, the words soft but weighted with the truth he'd been avoiding. "It's never just a murder with me. But you can't understand. Laura wasn't just another singer. She wasn't just some pretty face on a stage." He turned away, his words trailing off as his eyes narrowed on the shadows where the night seemed to press in, as if the very darkness held answers he couldn't quite reach. She was something else. Effie watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without breaking her stance, she pushed off from the doorframe and took a slow step toward him, the rhythmic click of her boots a constant reminder that she was always in motion. There was no slowing down for Effie. Not when the world was as broken and fragmented as it was. And she knew, just as well as Charlie did, that the only way to keep the pieces from slipping completely out of reach was to keep moving forward. "Laura's always something else," Effie said, her tone shifting, taking on that smooth, analytical edge that told Charlie she was trying to ground him. "But right now, the thing we need to figure out is why she disappeared in the first place." She paused for a second, letting the words sink in. "Because whatever you think she was, whatever you think she meant, that's what we need to untangle if we're ever going to get her back." Charlie glanced at her, eyes filled with the kind of weariness that only came from too many sleepless nights chasing after ghosts. "I'm not sure I can just untangle her, Effie," he said quietly. "She wasn't just a case. You don't get it, do you? She had this way of singing, of making everything feel alive. When she sang, everything, every second, every word meant something." His voice dropped into a whisper, almost as if the words themselves were fragile. "I need to know what happened to that." Effie let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh, but her eyes didn't leave him. "Charlie, I get it," she said, a rare softness creeping into her voice, the kind of softness only reserved for moments like this. "But you're falling into it. That's the thing about people like Laura. Hell, about people like us. We want to find meaning in everything. But sometimes, things just happen. And if we're going to find her, if we're going to make sense of this, we can't afford to get lost in the why of it all." Charlie wanted to argue. He wanted to push back, to tell her that she was wrong, that he had to understand the why. But Effie's words had a weight to them. She was right, in a way. He couldn't afford to get lost in the details. Not when he was so close to unraveling the larger mystery that had been creeping up on him, inch by inch. He finally looked at her, really looked at her. Effie Fontaine, with her wild intelligence and sharp humor, was right there beside him, unwavering as always. She wasn't just his partner, she was the one person who kept him tethered to the ground when his mind wanted to float off into the ether. She was his anchor, his reminder that the city wasn't just a collection of stories. It was real, gritty, and often dangerous. "You know, Effie," Charlie said, his voice low but sincere, "I couldn't do this without you." Effie smirked, the familiar edge of humor returning to her face. "You say that now. But we both know it's your poetic side that'll get us into trouble eventually." Charlie let out a chuckle, a brief, fleeting moment of release. "Maybe," he agreed, "but maybe it's what keeps us alive." Effie's gaze softened, her eyes catching the reflections of the city lights, and for just a second, Charlie saw a flicker of something else. Something more than the hardened, sharp-eyed detective he knew. But before he could reach for the thought, Effie broke the silence with a small nod, her lips curving into that familiar, reassuring smile. "All right, partner," she said, her voice now filled with that trademark calm certainty. "Let's untangle this poem. Together." And with that, Charlie knew he wasn't alone in this, not in the mess of thoughts or the web of uncertainty that had him tangled in knots. Effie would be there, cutting through the dark and helping him find the light again. Effie slid a newspaper across the table, the crisp sound of paper scraping against the old wood filling the otherwise silent room. Charlie's eyes flickered to the headline, and the familiar ache in his chest tightened. The words jumped off the page, bold and unforgiving. "Beloved songbird found dead. Mystery deepens at Velvet Vale." It was the kind of headline that had a way of sticking to you like a bad memory. It promised answers but gave none, a tantalizing glimpse into a story that was too incomplete to make sense of. Charlie's fingers hovered over the paper for a moment before he picked it up. The ink smudged slightly where the paper had been folded too many times, and his eyes traced the same words, over and over again, though the meaning never seemed to change. "Beloved songbird." The phrase felt like a betrayal, the kind of words people used when they couldn't quite comprehend the truth about someone, when they couldn't see the complexities that made them human. Laura Sinclair had never been just a songbird. She had been so much more. She had been a force, a woman who sang with the weight of the world in her voice, and now here she was, reduced to a headline. Effie tapped the page with one finger, her knuckles light against the paper. It was a gesture that seemed casual, but Charlie knew her better than that. Effie didn't do anything without purpose. She was always thinking, always calculating, and when she tapped that page, it meant she was digging for something beyond the obvious. "What's the first thing you notice, Charlie?" she asked, her voice low but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. Charlie scanned the page again, his gaze moving over the grainy black and white photo of the Velvet Vale's neon-lit entrance, the image captured just before the club's doors had closed for good. It was a poor quality photo, but there was something about it. The way the lights flickered in the background, the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, something that unsettled him. He didn't have to look long to find it. He tapped the paper, his finger tracing the line of text beneath the headline. "Authorities have yet to determine cause of death." It was a subtle detail, one that might have been overlooked by anyone else, but not by Charlie. Effie knew he would pick up on it right away. "No cause of death," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "That doesn't sit right with me. You don't just find a body like that and not know how it happened, not in this city. Someone's keeping something quiet." Effie leaned back in her chair, watching him intently. "Exactly," she said, her voice steady but with a trace of something darker lurking beneath the surface. "You think they would have found something by now, don't you? They've had days to examine the body, but here they are, saying they're still unsure. That doesn't happen unless someone's making sure it stays that way." Charlie's mind started turning, the gears of his thoughts clicking into place one by one. He set the paper down on the table and rubbed a hand across his forehead, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that had been shattered into too many pieces. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't something that could be solved by simply finding the body and moving on. Something was off, something bigger than he had initially thought. He glanced up at Effie, who was watching him, her eyes sharp and calculating. "You know what this means, right?" he asked, his voice more certain now. "It means someone is trying to cover it up. Someone doesn't want the truth to get out." Effie didn't respond right away, but the look she gave him was all the confirmation he needed. She didn't need to say anything for him to know she was on the same page. They both knew this was bigger than it seemed. The Velvet Vale wasn't just some nightclub. It had been a hub for secrets, for power plays, for deals that happened in the shadows. Laura Sinclair had been a part of it, her voice weaving through the lives of people who had too much to hide. Now, it seemed that her death was just another secret waiting to be kept, another mystery to be buried beneath layers of lies. Charlie's gaze flickered back to the headline. Mystery deepens at Velvet Vale. It felt like a challenge, a dare. The words taunted him, daring him to dig deeper, to uncover what had really happened. But Charlie knew that mysteries like this didn't unravel themselves easily. They had a way of pulling you in, of wrapping themselves around you like a thick fog, until you couldn't see the truth for what it was. And when you did finally see it, it was often too late. He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "They're covering something up, Effie. And I need to know what it is." Effie's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of comfort. It was the kind of smile that hinted at something darker, something more dangerous lurking just beyond the surface. "You always do, Charlie. But be careful. The deeper you go, the more you risk losing yourself in it. You've seen it happen before." Charlie's expression hardened. "I don't care. I'm not walking away from this." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Laura deserves to have the truth told. And I'm going to make sure that happens, even if it means tearing this city apart to get there." Effie watched him rise, her expression unreadable. She didn't stop him. She didn't have to. She knew better than anyone that once Charlie Bennett made up his mind, there was no turning back. And in this city, once you started digging, you never knew what you'd find. But that was part of the allure, the danger, the thrill of it. And Charlie, well, he wasn't one to shy away from it. Not now, not ever. "Word is, Laura knew something about the shadowy owner of the nightclub," Effie said quietly, her voice lowering as though speaking the name out loud might summon the very darkness that surrounded him. "People are calling him the Ghost. No one knows his real name, but his connections run deep. Drugs, bribes, missing people. It's all part of his empire, one built on silence and fear." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang between them. Charlie stared at her, his gaze sharp, his mind racing. "The Ghost," he repeated softly, almost as if testing the sound of it. "It's fitting, isn't it? A man whose name is a whisper, a rumor, a shadow in the dark. No face, no identity, just a presence that looms over the city like a fog you can't escape." He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration evident in his movements. "A man like that doesn't just vanish into the background. He's calculated. Every step he takes is deliberate, every move carefully planned." Effie leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. "That's what makes him so dangerous, Charlie. He's not like the others. The Ghost doesn't make mistakes. Everything about him is calculated, even the way he's built his empire. He's left no trace, no evidence. He's the kind of man who knows how to make people disappear without a trace, how to cover his tracks so thoroughly that even the police don't dare to follow." Charlie's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger rising in him, but he kept it controlled, kept it buried under the surface. He'd seen this before. Powerful men who thought they could hide in the shadows, men who believed that their wealth and influence could protect them from everything. But Charlie had spent his life chasing shadows, pulling them into the light. And if the Ghost thought he could remain hidden forever, he was in for a rude awakening. "Whoever he is," Charlie said, his voice firm, each word carrying the weight of his resolve. "He just made a mistake. He left a thread dangling." Effie raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the confidence in his tone. "A thread?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of thread are we talking about here?" Charlie smirked, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Laura Sinclair. She was the thread. She knew something, and she wasn't afraid to sing about it. She was a force, Effie. She may have been wrapped in the glamour of the Velvet Veil, but she saw the city for what it was. A beautiful illusion, yes, but beneath that facade? Corruption, darkness. And she had a way of getting people to tell their stories without them even knowing it. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The ghost may have thought he could silence her, but he made the mistake of underestimating her. He didn't know what kind of woman he was dealing with. Laura wasn't just a singer, she was a storyteller, a truth-teller, whether people liked it or not. And now, she's left behind something he can't erase. A trail. Effie nodded, slowly taking in what he was saying. She could see the gears turning in Charlie's mind. He wasn't just talking about Laura's death. He was talking about a pattern, a trail of breadcrumbs that the ghost had left behind without realizing it. "You think she left something behind?" she asked, the skepticism in her voice giving way to a flicker of hope. Something the ghost overlooked? Charlie's eyes gleamed with purpose. "I know she did. She was too smart to get involved with someone like him without keeping something in her back pocket, something the ghost didn't know about. A song, a conversation, a note hidden somewhere only she knew. She wasn't just some naive girl falling for a dangerous man. Laura was playing a game, and she was playing it better than he ever realized." The more Charlie spoke, the more he felt certain of it. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The ghost, whoever he was, had been careful, but he wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, and now he was going to pay for them. Laura had connections of her own, Charlie continued, his mind already working through the possibilities. She had people who would listen to her, people who knew things, who understood the risks. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the city, there's a record, a clue, something that points back to him. She wasn't going to be silenced. Not like this. Not by a man who thought he could make her disappear. Effie sat back, considering his words. Her expression softened slightly, and for a moment, Charlie saw the flicker of admiration in her eyes. She knew the type of people he was up against, and she knew how dangerous this was going to get. But she also knew that Charlie Bennett wasn't the type of man to back down. Not when there was something worth fighting for. "You really believe that, don't you?" Effie asked quietly, her voice holding a trace of disbelief, but also a touch of respect. "You think Laura left something that can take down the ghost?" Charlie's lips curled into a grim smile. "I don't think it, Effie. I know it. And I'm going to find it, no matter where it's buried." His eyes darkened, a fire lighting in them. The ghost thought he could erase her, erase all of her truths. But he's about to learn that when you play with fire, you don't always get to control where the flames go. Effie took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "All right, then. Let's pull on that thread. But you better be ready. The deeper we go, the more dangerous it's going to get. The ghost isn't just some name on a page. He's a living, breathing nightmare." Charlie stood up from the table, determination settling in his bones. "I've dealt with nightmares before. Let's see if the ghost can survive the light." The Velvet Veil wasn't just a nightclub. It was a labyrinth of illusions, a world built on the illusion of luxury and secrecy, where the line between fantasy and reality blurred into a haze of whispered promises. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, expensive perfumes, and the faintest hint of smoke that seemed to linger from the moments of whispered deals and forbidden conversations. The red velvet drapes that lined the walls hung like heavy curtains of mystery, their rich, opulent texture swallowing the dim light that tried to cut through the shadows. It was as if the entire place was wrapped in a deep, seductive secret, a world where everything glimmered but nothing was quite as it seemed. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen drops of molten glass, dripping with crystal tendrils that refracted the soft light in 1,000 directions. The light danced like shattered rainbows across the floor, casting fleeting, colorful reflections that skittered across the polished marble like ghostly memories of things forgotten. Each beam seemed to promise a story, but the stories were always just out of reach, slipping through the cracks in the cracks of time. The sounds of clinking glasses and soft laughter blended with the distant thrum of the live band, whose bass vibrated beneath their feet, pulling them deeper into the heart of the Velvet Vale's haunting pulse. Charlie and Effie entered through the tall, arched doors, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that stretched across the floor. For a moment, Charlie paused, his senses absorbing the scene before him. The Velvet Vale was alive, yet still. It had that kind of energy, the kind that came with decades of history, where every inch of the space had witnessed secrets exchanged, deals brokered, lives changed. The patrons, hidden behind the thick fog of cigarette smoke and dim lighting, moved like shadows, their faces half obscured by the haze, their conversations murmured in hushed tones as if the air itself might reveal their intentions. Effie, on the other hand, slipped into the atmosphere effortlessly, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been in places just like this before. She knew how to read the subtle signs, who was nervous, who was too comfortable, who was trying to hide something. But even she couldn't deny the overwhelming sense of disquiet that hung in the air tonight. Something felt off. It wasn't just the haunting music that seemed to creep up their spine with every note. It was the tension, a quiet unease that settled over the room, like an invisible storm gathering just above their heads. Charlie felt it too. He knew the Velvet Vale had its own pulse, its own rhythm. He'd been here before, but tonight, it felt different. There were eyes watching from every corner, people who were too aware of his presence, too careful with their words. In this place, secrets were currency, and every whisper had the potential to expose a lie, to unravel a truth that wasn't meant to be uncovered. As they moved deeper into the nightclub, the sound of the live band intensified, the saxophone notes winding through the air like smoky tendrils. The spotlight on the stage shifted, briefly illuminating the figure of a woman, her back to the audience, the soft shimmer of her silver dress reflecting the light as she bent low to the piano keys, creating a melody that seemed to cut through the noise, sharp and aching. She wasn't Laura, but for a brief moment, Charlie felt a pang in his chest, a reminder of the woman who had once commanded this very stage. Laura Sinclair had made the Velvet Vale her kingdom, her voice the soundtrack to the lives of the people who filled this space. But now, she was gone. Her absence hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that remained unsolved. Effie noticed his hesitation and glanced at him. Her lips curled into a smirk, but her eyes were sharp, focused. "You're not here for the music, Charlie," she said, her voice barely rising above the hum of the crowd. "Focus. We're not here to mourn her loss. We're here to find what she left behind." Charlie shook himself out of his reverie, his gaze hardening. Effie was right. The Velvet Vale was full of distractions, full of things meant to keep them from the truth. But he wasn't here for the glitz, the glamour, or the dim allure of the spotlight. He was here for Laura. He was here for the thread she had left behind, the one that led to the ghost. And he wouldn't leave until he pulled on it, until the darkness hiding in the corners of this place was dragged into the light. The duo made their way through the crowd, their steps confident but measured, as if every motion had been rehearsed. A bartender nodded as they passed, recognizing them without a word, his eyes flicking briefly to the half-empty glass in Charlie's hand. He didn't need to speak, it was the unspoken agreement of this world. Everyone had their role, even the ghosts. In the distance, Charlie noticed the familiar figure of the club's manager, a man named Roy. Tall, gaunt, and always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, Roy had the look of someone who existed entirely in the shadows. He was a fixture of the Velvet Vale, someone who blended into the background so seamlessly that people often forgot he was there at all. But Charlie knew better. Roy was the keeper of the club's secrets. He had to be. Everyone here had something to hide, and Roy was the one who made sure those secrets stayed hidden. "Let's talk to him," Charlie murmured, his voice low but filled with purpose. "Maybe he knows more than he's letting on." Effie nodded, and they began to weave their way through the sea of faces, the air thickening with the sense that they were being watched, that every step was being measured, calculated. The Velvet Veil wasn't just a nightclub, it was a kingdom built on secrets, and Charlie Bennett had every intention of tearing its walls down, one whisper at a time. "Charlie, I feel like we just walked into a spider's web," Effie whispered, her sharp eyes scanning the room, darting from face to face, every flicker of movement registering in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to solve. The people around them seemed oblivious to the two of them moving through the room, but Effie knew better. In a place like this, every person, every glance, every subtle shift in posture meant something. The Velvet Veil might have looked like a haven for the city's lost souls, but to Effie, it was a maze, and every twist and turn of the room was a thread in the web they'd just entered. The air around them was thick with the hum of quiet conversations, the low clink of glasses, and the murmur of idle gossip that hung like a cloud. The band was playing softly in the background, but Effie's senses were tuned to a different frequency now. It wasn't the music she heard, but the way the room seemed to pulse, how every person in here had something to hide, and how every little movement felt like it could tip the balance. She'd been in places like this before, but the Velvet Veil had its own rhythm, its own rules. It was a space where danger was always just beneath the surface, and right now, she could almost taste it in the air. Her fingers brushed the side of her coat as she adjusted the holster beneath her jacket, her hand resting lightly on the cold steel, as if reassuring herself that she was prepared for anything. Charlie was beside her, calm and steady as always, but she could sense the same tautness in his posture. He didn't say much, but she could read him like an open book. He was just as aware as she was of the tension creeping through the room like a slow burn. "Good," Charlie replied, his voice low and unwavering. His gaze never left the crowd as he carefully assessed every person in their path, his eyes narrowing slightly when he caught sight of a man in a dark suit leaning too casually against the far wall, his eyes flicking back and forth across the room with too much intensity. Because spiders eventually have to meet the flies they've caught. Effie shot him a sideways glance, her lips curling slightly at the edges. Charlie always had a way of putting things in a way that made them sound inevitable. He wasn't just stating a fact, he was making a promise. The kind of promise that left no room for doubt. Effie had known Charlie long enough to recognize the shift in his demeanor, that quiet intensity that always preceded a storm. It was in the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly, in the way his jaw tightened just a fraction. He was ready, and for him, a trap was just another opportunity to expose the truth hiding beneath it. As they continued to weave through the crowd, Effie's senses remained on high alert. She didn't need to say anything. She could feel the shift in the air herself. There were too many people here, too many faces that were just a little too perfect, too practiced. And the longer they stayed in the Velvet Veil, the more it felt like they were being drawn into something much bigger than a single murder. The web wasn't just about Laura Sinclair anymore. It was about everything this place represented, everything that lingered just out of sight, waiting to be uncovered. She glanced at Charlie again, noticing the way his eyes flicked toward the back of the room, toward the private booth that was always reserved for those who mattered, those who could afford to be hidden away from the prying eyes of the public. It was there, in that dark corner, where the real business of the Velvet Veil was done. And she knew that whatever answers they were looking for, they wouldn't come from the surface. The deeper they went, the more tangled the threads would become, but that didn't scare her. It was just part of the game. And with Charlie by her side, she knew they'd find their way to the heart of the web. The low rumble of conversation seemed to swell around them, the laughter and the clinking of glasses rising in volume as they made their way toward the back. Charlie's gaze never wavered, his steps purposeful, but his mind was always 3 steps ahead, mapping out every potential exit, every possible move, every person in the room who could be part of the puzzle they were trying to piece together. Effie let out a quiet breath and adjusted her stance, letting the weight of her hand on her holster become a reminder of the stakes. They weren't just here to find answers. They were here to find the ghost, the man who controlled everything behind the scenes, the one who had pulled the strings that led to Laura's death. And as much as the Velvet Veil was a den of illusion and mystery, it was also a place where power was concentrated, hidden in plain sight. It was only a matter of time before they caught someone's eye, before they found the right person to pull on that dangling thread. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, Charlie," Effie murmured, the edge in her voice sharpening as she glanced around. "They're watching us." Charlie's lips barely moved as he replied, his voice smooth and controlled. "Let them. The longer they watch, the more they reveal." Effie's lips quirked upward in a wry smile. He wasn't wrong. In a place like this, every eye, every glance, every whisper meant something. And if they were careful enough, if they moved with the right kind of patience, they could turn those eyes into allies, into the very instruments they needed to tear the web apart from the inside. They were in the spider's nest now. And once you're in, there's only one thing left to do. "Let's see who makes the first move," Charlie added, his voice low but steady. And with that, they stepped further into the heart of the Velvet Veil, the world of secrets and shadows closing in around them, knowing that every step they took, every move they made would bring them one step closer to the truth. They approached the bar, the air thick with the scent of aged whiskey and the sharp tang of citrus. The soft murmur of conversation around them seemed to fade into a distant hum as they drew closer to the counter. Behind it, the bartender moved with the precision of someone who had mastered the art of pouring drinks for decades. His hands worked like a machine, pouring, shaking, stirring. Never a drop wasted, never a motion too slow. The rhythmic clink of glass against wood was the only sound that accompanied the otherwise quiet atmosphere as Charlie and Effie slid into their seats. Charlie's eyes never left the bartender's face as he leaned in slightly, his voice low and deliberate. The man was a fixture here, a part of the Velvet Veil's fabric, yet his eyes told a different story. He was more than just someone who mixed drinks. He was a keeper of secrets, one who had seen it all from behind the bar, where everyone let their guard down just enough to reveal a little too much. Charlie reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, the edges curling slightly from time and handling. With a fluid motion, he slid it across the counter, the image of Laura Sinclair frozen in time, her vibrant smile a sharp contrast to the cold reality of her absence. Her eyes, wide and full of life in the photo, seemed to stare back at the bartender as if daring him to speak. The bartender didn't flinch. His hands paused mid-motion, the jigger still held loosely in his grip. For a moment, the atmosphere shifted, the usual hum of the room stuttering as the photo landed with a soft thud on the bar. His eyes flicked briefly to the image before snapping back to Charlie, calculating, guarded. He wiped his hands on the towel hanging from his shoulder, giving nothing away. "She had a voice that could stop traffic," Charlie began, his tone conversational but underlined with an intensity that only people like him could possess. "What do you know about her last night here?" The bartender's eyes flickered with something. A memory, perhaps, or a fear too familiar. But he quickly masked it with a practiced indifference, setting the jigger down with a soft clink, the sound far too loud in the sudden silence that had settled between them. His eyes lingered on the photo for a moment longer, then moved to Charlie's face, sizing him up like a man who had seen too many similar faces over the years. The silence between them stretched, thickening like smoke, until finally, the bartender leaned in closer, his voice low and almost inaudible over the din of the bar. "I don't know what you think you'll find, detective," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "But you're asking the wrong questions. People come and go in this place all the time, and if you think you're gonna get anything out of me, you'll be here until the morning light." Some things are better left unsaid. Charlie's eyes didn't waver. He wasn't a man easily intimidated, and he wasn't in the mood for games. "You've seen something," he said flatly. "You've seen her, you've seen the people she was with. You've seen everything, haven't you?" His voice was quiet but cutting, like a blade in the dark. He wasn't asking for pleasantries, he was asking for truth. The bartender hesitated, a brief flicker of hesitation crossing his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He wiped his hands on the towel again, his movements growing more deliberate, as though stalling for time. But in the silence that followed, the truth hung in the air, thick and palpable. Effie, ever the observer, noticed the way the bartender's hand trembled ever so slightly as he poured a drink for a customer at the other end of the bar. It wasn't much, but it was enough to signal something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his calm facade. She leaned in, her voice low and smooth, a gentle push where Charlie's was sharp and direct. "You don't have to tell us everything," she said, her eyes never leaving his face. "Just the truth. Start with her last night. Who was she with? What happened?" The bartender's gaze shifted from Effie to Charlie, then back to the photo of Laura, a long, drawn-out breath escaping his lips. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with him. He glanced around the bar, as if checking to make sure no one was listening too closely, before his eyes returned to the photograph of Laura. His voice dropped even lower, barely a whisper. "She was with someone," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not the usual crowd. She was different that night. Nervous, but trying to hide it. Like she was running from something, or someone. I don't know who he was. I didn't ask. But I can tell you this, when he left, she wasn't the same. She looked like she'd seen a ghost." Charlie's eyes narrowed. "Tell me more," he pressed. His voice was gentle now, coaxing, but there was an undeniable edge to it. He wasn't about to let the bartender off so easily. The bartender swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room again, scanning for eavesdroppers. He leaned in even closer, the smell of whiskey and stale smoke clinging to him like a shroud. "You're asking about more than just her last night," he said quietly, his voice almost a rasp. "You want to know what she knew. And that's where things get tricky. Laura Sinclair didn't just sing songs, she heard things. She overheard things. Things she shouldn't have. And when she started asking the right questions, well, people started getting nervous. People who don't like their business out in the open." Effie's eyes flicked to Charlie, her mind working quickly. She could see the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but they weren't quite fitting yet. The bartender wasn't finished though, and Charlie knew better than to rush him. Patience was always key. Finally, the bartender leaned back, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of what he had just shared had been lifted off him, even if only for a moment. "All I know is she left here that night in a hurry," he said, his voice growing quieter. "And the last thing I saw was that man. He didn't walk out. He disappeared into the alley. Just vanished." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. This was the lead he'd been waiting for. The ghost wasn't just a myth. He was here, in the heart of the city, leaving his mark on everyone he touched. And now, it seemed, Laura Sinclair had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to know. Charlie slid his hand over the bar, his fingers brushing the edge of the photo. "Where did she go after that?" he asked, the question almost a demand. The bartender shook his head, his face a mask of regret and something deeper, fear. "I don't know," he muttered. "But if you're going after him, you'd better be careful. No one who gets too close to the ghost walks away unscathed." Charlie nodded, a cold resolve settling over him. This wasn't just about Laura Sinclair anymore. It was about everything the velvet veil had been hiding in plain sight. And now, it was time to peel back the layers. The bartender hesitated, his eyes darting nervously to the mirrored wall behind him, where the reflections of the dimly lit bar stretched endlessly. There was a tension in the air, a quiet crackle of anticipation, as if the very walls of the velvet veil were listening in on their conversation. The glassy reflection of the bar looked distorted in the mirror, almost like a twisted version of the reality that surrounded them. It was a subtle, eerie detail, but Charlie could see the bartender's gaze flicker toward it, like a man who had learned to trust his instincts more than his eyes. The room, full of life and noise, now felt colder, more oppressive, like a snake coiled, ready to strike. Charlie leaned in, his voice lowering, each word cutting through the thick air between them. His tone, low and controlled, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. "Look, pal," he said, his gaze locking onto the bartender's, unflinching. "You talk to me now, or you talk to me later, when the city's morgue gets another visitor." His words hung in the air, sharp and chilling, the warning clear. He didn't need to threaten anyone directly, but he knew how to make people feel the weight of consequences. "Your choice." The bartender swallowed visibly, his throat bobbing in discomfort. His eyes flickered briefly toward the door, almost as if weighing his chances of making a run for it. But the sleek, polished wood of the bar, the tight corners of the room, and the knowing eyes of Charlie and Effie were closing in on him. He was trapped in a maze of his own making, with no escape except the truth. The bartender rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers brushing over the stubble there as he tried to steady his breathing. The glass he'd been polishing moments ago now lay forgotten in front of him, as though his mind had checked out, unwilling to carry out even the smallest task. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a strained exhale, like the sound of someone trying to fight the truth back into the shadows. His fingers twitched nervously, betraying him with every movement. Effie, sensing the tension building, shifted in her seat, leaning forward just enough to catch the bartender's attention without breaking the delicate standoff. Her voice broke through the tension like a knife slicing through fog, though it was playful enough to defuse the looming threat. "Charlie, maybe try to be less terrifying," she quipped, her lips curling into a teasing smile. "This isn't a noir film." Her eyes glinted with humor, the kind of humor that didn't just lighten the mood but threw the bartender off balance. Charlie straightened, his posture relaxing just enough to give off a sense of control but not vulnerability. He shot Effie a look, almost a smirk, before turning back to the bartender. "She's right, I could be more polite," Charlie said, though his voice still held that same weight. He wasn't about to back off. Not now, not when they were this close. "But I'm not here to make friends, and neither are you." He leaned in again, his tone dropping, hardening like steel. "We both know you've seen something, so now's the time to share it. Before someone else gets the same idea, and you find yourself in deeper than you ever wanted." The bartender's gaze flickered to Effie, then back to Charlie. His hands clenched around the rag he was holding, his knuckles white. The air felt too thick now, as if every breath he took was weighed down by secrets he wasn't ready to share. But there was something in Charlie's eyes, something relentless, that told the bartender his options were running out. He could either give them what they needed, or he could face the consequences of staying silent. Finally, after a long pause, the bartender sighed, almost inaudibly. His shoulders dropped as though a great weight had just settled on them, and his eyes fell to the bar in front of him, unwilling to meet their gaze any longer. "All right," he muttered, his voice low and raw. "I'll tell you what I know." His words were reluctant, but they were coming now, as though once the dam broke, there was no turning back. Charlie's gaze softened, but only slightly. He wasn't done. "Go on," he urged, his voice steady now, urging the man forward with the calm of a predator who knew exactly when to strike. Effie's eyes remained fixed on the bartender, watching him closely, sensing the shifting undercurrents of fear and regret. She could tell that whatever he was about to say, it was going to change everything. The bartender took another deep breath, his hand now trembling slightly as it hovered over the glass he had been polishing. He glanced briefly at Effie, then back to Charlie, as though gauging whether this was a safe space to speak. But in the end, he just nodded, resigned to the inevitable. He'd been cornered by a truth far too big for him to escape. "You're right about her," he began, his voice rough, like someone who had been holding something in for far too long. "She wasn't like the rest of them. She knew things. She saw things. And the guy she was with last night, he wasn't from around here. But he had money. A lot of money. And he was worried, nervous even. They were arguing before she took the stage, and then, after her set, they left together. But not the way you'd think." He paused, his eyes shifting nervously between Charlie and Effie. It was like she didn't want anyone to see her go. Charlie was still as stone, though inside his mind was racing. The pieces were finally starting to fit. The ghost was tied to this. And whatever Laura Sinclair had uncovered, whatever truth she had stumbled upon, was now more dangerous than ever. "Go on," Charlie said again, his voice barely a whisper now. The bartender exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if he was still trying to convince himself it was all just some bad dream. "She was being followed," he muttered finally. "I saw them, 2 men, watching her from across the room. They weren't there for the show, that much was clear. And after she left with that guy, one of them followed them out. I didn't see what happened after that, but I heard things. I heard the noise in the alley. Screams. Then, nothing." Charlie nodded, the weight of the bartender's words sinking in like a heavy stone dropped into a well. The bartender's confession had opened a door that could not be shut again. Effie's voice broke the silence, her tone almost casual, but there was an edge to it. "You should probably think twice before keeping things like that to yourself again," she said, her smile still in place but her eyes cold as ice. "Next time, you might not be so lucky." The bartender sighed deeply, as though the weight of his confession had finally started to settle in. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, despite the cool air around them, as if his nerves were betraying him. His gaze dropped to the counter, avoiding the intensity of Charlie and Effie's stares. He'd been holding on to this truth for far too long, and now it was spilling out of him, piece by reluctant piece. Laura met someone in the VIP lounge. "A man in a black coat," he said, his voice almost a whisper, as though speaking any louder would invite the walls themselves to listen in. "I didn't see him at first, but I could feel something wasn't right. The way she looked at him, her face was pale. She wasn't the same Laura I'd seen every night. She was different, nervous. And that man, something about him didn't sit right with me." Effie's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in a fraction closer. "What do you mean by different?" she pressed, her tone cool but laced with suspicion. She wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily, not when the stakes were so high. The bartender swallowed hard, his mouth dry as if the words were stuck in his throat. He glanced nervously at the door, as though he expected someone to walk in and stop him from saying anything more. But there was no turning back now. She seemed scared. Like she was trying to hide it, but it was there in her eyes. Like she knew something she wasn't supposed to know. His words trailed off, as though he was too afraid to say more. Charlie watched the bartender with an intensity that made him uneasy, but it also pushed him to continue. "Scared enough to run, or scared enough to stand her ground?" Effie asked sharply, the words cutting through the thick tension that had settled in the air. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him as if she could read the truth right off his soul. The bartender hesitated again, his eyes flickering to the side, to the mirrored wall where he could see his own reflection. A man trapped between the fear of the unknown and the weight of what he was about to reveal. He took another slow breath, trying to steady himself. but the silence between them stretched out like a long, dark tunnel. She wasn't running, not exactly, he finally murmured. But she wasn't standing her ground either. It was like she was trying to make a decision, but something held her back. Her hands were shaking when she picked up her drink, and when she spoke to him, her voice was so low, I could barely hear it. And then she asked him if he was the one who'd been following her. Effie's brow furrowed, the weight of that revelation settling into the conversation like a heavy cloud. Following her, she repeated, her voice tight with disbelief. What do you mean by following her? The bartender nodded, his eyes darting from Charlie to Effie as if looking for confirmation that it was safe to keep talking. There were two men, earlier in the night. They didn't seem like the kind of people who'd come to a nightclub for a good time, you know? They were just watching her, just staring at her, like they knew something. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think much of it. But when she came out of the lounge with that guy in the black coat, I saw one of them follow her. I don't know where he went after that, but she didn't look like herself when she walked out of here. Something was wrong. It's like she was already running from something. Even before she left, Charlie felt a chill run down his spine, the dots starting to connect in his mind, forming a clearer picture of the danger that had been closing in on Laura Sinclair. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. The ghost, he muttered under his breath, as though the name itself carried the weight of 1,000 sins. He's been watching her. And he's not done yet. Effie's eyes darkened, the pieces of the puzzle starting to snap together. So she knew she was in danger, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. She wasn't just scared for no reason. She knew they were coming for her. But what did she know about him? Why was she the one they were after? The bartender looked between them, his gaze darting nervously once more, the burden of knowing too much pressing down on him. I don't know all the details, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was something about that guy in the black coat. He was too calm, too controlled, and I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just here to have a drink and enjoy the show. He was here for something bigger. Something darker. He kept looking at Laura like she was a problem he needed to take care of. Effie sat back, her mind racing with the possibilities. That's when she realized it, she murmured, almost to herself. She realized she wasn't just a performer to him. She was the key to something bigger. Something dangerous. Charlie nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation settling in. And the ghost isn't going to stop until he gets whatever it is she knew. He made a mistake though. His voice hardened, a spark of determination flickering in his eyes. He underestimated Laura. She was smarter than they gave her credit for. And now we're going to find out exactly what she knew, and how far this thing goes. Effie didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the bartender as though she was piecing together the fragmented puzzle of Laura Sinclair's final hours. What happened after that? She asked finally, her voice cutting through the silence with a quiet intensity. The bartender's hands were trembling now, as if the weight of the conversation had settled fully onto him. He glanced around the room once more, ensuring no one else was listening, before he spoke again. After she left with the man in the black coat, I didn't see her again, he said softly. But I heard something. I heard the screaming. And I'm telling you, it wasn't just a fight. It was desperation. He paused, swallowing hard. And then, nothing. I never saw her again. Charlie's eyes darkened, the pieces of the mystery falling into place. The city's shadows were closing in, and the ghost had left his mark. But this story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. As the pair delved deeper, each layer of the case revealed something darker, more twisted than the last. What had initially seemed like a murder mystery was beginning to unravel into something far more sinister. Something that had taken root within the very heart of the city's nightlife. The Velvet Veil wasn't just a hotspot for music and drunken revelry. It was a well-oiled machine in a much larger, shadowy network. A network that operated in the underbelly of society, masked by the dazzling lights and the intoxicating rhythm of jazz. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. Behind the curtains of velvet, beyond the hypnotic sway of the dancers, and under the charm of the night's performers, there was a darker reality. Human trafficking, a hidden operation, cleverly disguised under the glitz of cocktails and spotlights. Laura, it seemed, had stumbled upon it. She hadn't just been a victim of some random act of violence. She had become a threat to something much larger. The Ghost's empire wasn't built on drugs or bribes alone. It was built on lives, stolen, sold, and discarded. Charlie and Effie knew that the information they had already gathered was just the tip of the iceberg. The Velvet Veil, once a beacon of the city's nightlife, was merely a facade for something much more depraved. They had seen the signs, the nervous whispers among the staff, the strange visitors slipping in and out of the club at odd hours, and the subtle change in Laura's demeanor just before she died. She had been scared because she had uncovered the truth. She had seen the faces of the victims, maybe even tried to help them, and in doing so, had signed her own death warrant. It wasn't long before their investigation led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. A place that felt more like a forgotten relic of the past than a part of the bustling modern world. It was an industrial labyrinth of rusted metal and cracked concrete, where the noise of the city was nothing but a distant hum. The warehouse was isolated, far from the prying eyes of the public. Just the kind of place where the Ghost's operations could thrive in the shadows. As they approached, Charlie's instincts were on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a gust of wind swept through the empty streets, carrying with it the smell of decay and rot. It was the kind of place where hope went to die. The eerie silence of the area pressed down on them, and every step felt like an intrusion into something that didn't belong to them. Effie, ever the skeptic but sharp as a knife, kept her eyes darting to every corner, every darkened alley, every possible hiding place. She knew they weren't alone. The shadows of the warehouse stretched long into the night, and as Charlie and Effie approached, they could make out the faint glow of dim, yellow lights seeping through cracks in the building's corrugated metal walls. The air was thick with the scent of old machinery and the metallic tang of sweat, an unmistakable sign that the Ghost's men had been here, working in the dark corners of the building. They crept closer, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the gravel underfoot. Charlie pulled a flashlight from his coat pocket, its beam cutting through the darkness as they moved cautiously toward the entrance. The door creaked ominously when Charlie pushed it open, revealing a vast, hollow interior. The floor was littered with crates and discarded boxes, all seemingly forgotten in the quiet aftermath of whatever business had been conducted here. There were no signs of life, just the faint echo of their breath in the cold, stale air. But they both knew better than to think they were alone. The place had the unmistakable feel of a location used for something illegal, something that demanded secrecy and the silencing of witnesses. The walls were adorned with faded graffiti, remnants of the ghosts of lives once lived in places like this. As Charlie stepped further into the warehouse, his flashlight flickered, revealing signs of a struggle, a shattered crate, broken glass on the floor, and the faintest traces of dried blood. Effie's eyes narrowed. "This is it," she whispered, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "This is where they were hiding everything. The trafficking operation, the people they've been exploiting, they've been kept here." Charlie didn't respond immediately, his focus completely on the path ahead. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the weight of the danger that pressed in on them from every direction. It wasn't just the Ghost they had to worry about now, it was the men who worked for him, the ones who would kill to protect their empire. They moved further inside, the silence now deafening, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional scrape of shoes against the uneven floor. The deeper they went, the more it became clear that the operation wasn't just happening here. This place was a hub, a central point in a much larger network. Crates labeled with random, innocuous names, tapestries, furniture, machinery, were stacked high, but there was something about them, something off about the way they were arranged. The shipping labels were forged. The contents were more than just ordinary goods, and the men who guarded them were nowhere to be found. Charlie crouched beside one of the crates, prying it open with his hands. Inside, there were stacks of documents, official-looking papers, contracts, passports, and shipping manifests. His pulse quickened as he rifled through the files. Effie leaned over his shoulder, her sharp gaze scanning the contents as quickly as he did. "These are fake passports," Effie murmured, her voice tinged with disgust. "These are people's lives, being moved around like they're nothing. We've stumbled into the heart of the operation." Charlie's hands trembled as he grabbed a handful of documents. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered. "Laura must have seen this. She must have realized what was going on here. And she tried to stop it. And that's why she's dead." As the full scope of the operation came into focus, they knew they were no longer just hunting for a killer. They were hunting for a criminal empire. An empire that had been operating in the dark for far too long. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, one thing was certain: they couldn't turn back now. Not until they brought the ghost's empire to its knees. When they arrived, the air reeked of damp wood and betrayal, thick and oppressive, as though the walls themselves were suffocating under the weight of the secrets they had absorbed over the years. The building stood on the outskirts of the city like a forgotten relic, nestled among overgrown weeds and rusted fencing. Its dark silhouette loomed in the distance as they approached, the cold wind carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Every step they took seemed to echo, amplified by the emptiness of the space around them. Charlie and Effie moved with careful, deliberate steps, as though every creaking floorboard might give them away. The silence in the warehouse was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of a distant generator, its intermittent sputtering a reminder of the long-abandoned nature of this place. The faintest light from their flashlights danced across the walls, revealing decades-old graffiti and faded posters that barely clung to the walls, like the last remnants of a forgotten era. The atmosphere felt thick with history, bitter, unspoken, and full of betrayal. As they moved deeper into the building, Charlie's senses were heightened, his mind racing with the possibilities of what they might find. Every shadow could hide a threat, every corner might conceal another piece of the puzzle. They were no longer just looking for answers. They were walking into the heart of darkness, where the truth had been buried so deeply that it seemed almost impossible to uncover. And yet, they were there, determined to pull it into the light. "Charlie, do you ever think about why we do this?" Effie's voice broke the tension, barely a whisper in the stillness of the night. Her grip on her flashlight tightened, knuckles white, as she kept her eyes scanning the shadows around them. The question hung in the air, unanswered for a long beat, as Charlie paused, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, the weight of her words sinking in. They had been partners for so long, side by side in the grime and grit of the city's underworld, piecing together broken lives and unraveling twisted mysteries. But in the quiet of that dilapidated warehouse, the air thick with the scent of mildew and secrets, her question seemed more profound than ever before. "Why we do this?" Charlie repeated softly, as if testing the words in his mind. His voice was steady, but there was a subtle undercurrent of weariness. The years of chasing shadows and running through mazes of lies had taken their toll. He could feel it in his bones, how each case had chipped away at something deep inside him, each revelation more haunting than the last. And yet, he still kept going. "I don't know," he admitted after a long moment. "Maybe it's because someone has to. People like Laura. Like the ones we've seen disappear. They don't have a voice. They're swallowed by the city, by people who care more about power and money than lives. He paused, his eyes flicking to the walls around them, as if they held the answers. We dig through the dirt, Effie. And we do it because someone has to keep digging until we find something worth saving. Effie gave a small, grim smile. It wasn't a smile of comfort or encouragement. It was a recognition of the unspoken truth between them. They weren't in it for glory or recognition. They were in it because the world needed people like them. The broken pieces, the forgotten voices, the people no one cared about. Those were the ones they fought for. Even if it meant walking through places like this, where hope seemed as distant as the stars above, they still pressed forward. I guess you're right, she replied quietly. Someone has to fight for them. Even if it means getting lost in the dark, even if we never make it out. Charlie glanced at her, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. We'll make it out, Effie. We always do. The faintest glimmer of something almost like hope flickered in her eyes as she nodded. But beneath that, there was a weariness, a resignation that neither of them could shake. The city was a beast, a thing that swallowed people whole, chewed them up, and spit them out. They had been chasing it for so long, trying to unravel its mysteries, but the deeper they went, the more it seemed like they were losing themselves in the very same darkness they were trying to expose. They reached another corridor, their footsteps muffled by the damp, rotting floorboards beneath them. The beam from their flashlights caught on something. A door, slightly ajar. A cold gust of air slipped through the crack, carrying with it the faintest sound, a muffled voice, a low murmur from within. Did you hear that? Effie asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Charlie motioned for her to stay quiet. His senses were alive, alert. They were close, he could feel it. The final piece of the puzzle, hidden just beyond that door. They crept closer, the tension thick in the air, the faint sounds of their breathing filling the otherwise oppressive silence. Every step felt like they were drawing nearer to something inevitable. Charlie turned the handle slowly, pushing the door open just enough to peer inside. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating stacks of crates, old machinery, and, his breath caught, figures in the shadows moving with eerie precision. Whatever's behind this door, Charlie whispered, is more than just a case. It's the breaking point. Effie met his eyes, her expression resolute. Let's break it wide open then. All the time, Charlie replied, his voice steady and firm, though the weight of his words hung in the air between them. He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the darkened corners of the room as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. The question Effie had asked wasn't just about why they did this. It was a question that had been gnawing at him for years. The city, with all its secrets and shadows, had a way of wearing people down, of making them question their purpose. But no matter how much it drained him, how much it made him question his own resolve, Charlie knew one thing for sure. Someone had to keep going. Someone had to keep fighting. Because someone has to, he repeated, his tone softer now, but no less determined. This city's not all darkness, Effie. There's light too, if you know where to look for it. You just have to keep fighting through the shadows until you find it. And sometimes we're the ones who have to protect it. His words felt like a promise, an oath sworn not just to Effie, but to the countless lives that had been lost, forgotten, or broken by the underbelly of the city they had sworn to save. There was a moment of silence as his words settled into the space between them, before Effie gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. They both did. They had seen the darkness of this city too many times to count. The people whose lives were destroyed by forces beyond their control, the families torn apart, the innocents caught in the crossfire of power, money, and cruelty. But for every shadow, there was a flicker of light, and it was that light that kept them going, no matter how difficult the fight. In a world that seemed to have forgotten compassion, they were the ones who had to remind it. Charlie took a deep breath, his gaze focused ahead, where the hallway stretched into nothingness, the shadows growing longer with each step. He couldn't let himself dwell too long on the weight of the city's suffering. There were lives at stake, and he wasn't about to let the darkness swallow them whole. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, a shift in the air told him they weren't alone anymore. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, an unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the stillness of the place. It was something more, something darker. At the end of the corridor, a figure appeared. Cloaked in black, standing still as a shadow, the figure seemed to absorb the darkness around him, his form blending with the blackness like an extension of the night itself. The faintest glimmer of light from their flashlights revealed the outline of his hood, but nothing else. His face was obscured, swallowed by the cloak of shadows. Charlie's heart skipped a beat. The man standing there was no ordinary criminal. This was the ghost. The notorious figure had haunted the city's underworld for years. Whispers of him had passed from one frightened soul to another, but no one had ever seen him clearly. No one knew who he really was, or what he truly wanted. All they knew was that his influence stretched far and wide, wrapping its tendrils around every corner of the city. The ghost was a myth, a specter who thrived in the shadows, manipulating lives from a distance, orchestrating chaos with no regard for who it destroyed. But now, standing before them, the ghost was no longer a legend or a rumor. He was real. And he had been waiting for them. Charlie's fingers tightened around the handle of his flashlight, the light cutting through the gloom, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that no matter how brightly it shone, it would never be enough to reach this man. The ghost was beyond the reach of any light, any truth they could uncover. Didn't think you'd be foolish enough to come here, the ghost's voice, smooth as silk, echoed through the corridor. It was cold, void of any emotion, but there was something chilling about it. Something calculated. Charlie stood tall, squaring his shoulders. I'm not the one hiding in the dark, ghost. The world's moved on. Time to face the consequences. The ghost didn't move, didn't flinch. His presence was almost suffocating, as though the very air around him had been contaminated with his malicious aura. It was like trying to fight a storm. Every word felt like it was being suffocated in the pressure of his cold gaze. You don't know what you're up against, the ghost continued, his voice taking on an almost amused tone. You're chasing shadows, Charlie. You think you can bring light into this darkness? There's no light here, only the darkness I've created. Effie stepped forward, her eyes sharp and unwavering. We'll see about that, she said, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. The ghost didn't respond immediately. For a moment, the tension in the air was so thick, it felt as if the very walls of the warehouse were closing in on them. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the ghost lifted his hand, the sound of the fabric of his cloak rustling like whispers of 1,000 lost souls. Charlie's hand instinctively went to his gun, his finger hovering near the trigger. But he knew this was bigger than a confrontation in the dark. They weren't just up against a man. They were up against the entire system that had been feeding on the city for years. And the ghost, whoever he was at the center of it all. You think you can protect the light? The ghost asked, his tone now darkly amused. There's no protecting light in a city like this. It's too far gone. Charlie took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Then I guess I'll just have to prove you wrong. The ghost didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. But there was something in the air now, something that told Charlie the game had changed. The time for whispers and shadows was over. It was time to face the truth. And no matter how dark it was, no matter how twisted the path ahead seemed, Charlie was ready to walk through it. Because someone had to protect the light. And right now, that someone was him. So, you're the one causing all this noise, the ghost said, his voice low and gravelly, reverberating off the walls like the growl of some ancient predator. It wasn't the voice of someone simply speaking. It was the voice of someone used to commanding, someone accustomed to watching others cower before them. He didn't raise his tone or rush his words. Each syllable was deliberate, heavy with contempt, as if Charlie's presence was little more than an annoying interruption in a carefully constructed world of shadows and lies. Noise doesn't solve problems, the ghost continued, his words dripping with disdain. It creates them. It brings attention, causes distractions. You're just a fly buzzing around a spider's web. You won't escape, and neither will anyone else you care about. There was a stillness to the air, thick and suffocating, as if the entire warehouse held its breath. Every word the ghost spoke seemed to wrap itself around Charlie, attempting to crush him, to make him shrink back. But Charlie stood tall, his back straight and unwavering. There was no fear in his eyes, only the cold determination that had carried him through years of chasing ghosts in this broken city. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Every ounce of him was focused on the man who stood before him, cloaked in shadows. This was the man who had been pulling the strings in the dark, orchestrating the suffering of countless lives with a ruthless hand. And now, he was trying to do the same to Charlie, trying to silence him. But Charlie wasn't about to be silenced. Not this time. Not ever again. Charlie took a deliberate step forward, his shoes making a quiet echo against the damp floor. The flashlight's beam flickered slightly, the darkness pressing in around them like it had a mind of its own. But Charlie was resolute. The air in the warehouse grew colder with each step he took, as though the very walls of the building were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the tension. You think this is about noise? Charlie's voice was sharp, cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife through silk. His words were slow, deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost. Noise doesn't just get attention. It shakes things loose. It makes people question. And it makes people remember. Charlie's eyes never left the ghost's shadowed figure. He could feel the weight of the ghost's gaze, but it didn't faze him. In fact, it only fueled his resolve. He had spent too long in the shadows himself, too long watching as injustice crept through every alley, every corner of the city. Now it was his turn to shine a light on the truth. The real truth. And he wasn't about to let this man, this ghost, snuff it out. You think you control everything. You think the city belongs to you, Charlie continued, his voice firm now, steady, as though it was the sound of the city itself pushing back against the ghost's tyranny. But tonight, it fights back. Tonight, you're the one caught in the web you've woven. You're the one who's about to be exposed. The ghost said nothing at first, his expression hidden behind the hood of his cloak. But Charlie could feel the change in the air, the shift in the atmosphere. The ghost's silence wasn't one of confidence anymore. It was a silent recognition, a realization that maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated the stubbornness of a man with nothing left to lose. Charlie's heart beat steadily, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but there was something else, something more profound pulsing within him. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He wasn't just chasing down a faceless criminal. This was about something deeper, something far more personal. It was about justice for Laura Sinclair, a woman whose voice had once lit up the darkest corners of the city. A woman whose truth had been silenced by the very forces Charlie was standing against. This fight was no longer just a job. It was personal. And what makes you think you can stop me? The ghost finally spoke again, his voice like crushed gravel, but there was something different this time, a subtle shift. It was as though, for the first time, he was starting to see Charlie not as a mere nuisance, but as a threat. Charlie leaned in slightly, his stance wide and solid, as though daring the ghost to make the first move. "Because I know what you're hiding," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I know that the darkness you've wrapped yourself in is a lie. You can't hide forever. No matter how deep you bury yourself, the truth will always claw its way to the surface. And when it does, there's no escaping it. The ghost's hood shifted ever so slightly, and for a moment, Charlie could have sworn he saw the faintest flicker of uncertainty in the dark figure before him. But it was gone in an instant, swallowed by the shadows once more. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until the ghost finally spoke again, his tone low and venomous. "You're already too late, detective," the ghost said, his voice no longer the cool, calculated mask it once was. There was something almost desperate underneath, something raw and untamed. "You can't stop what's already in motion." Charlie's lips curled into a small, knowing smirk. "We'll see about that." With those words, everything changed. The moment hung in the air like the calm before a storm, but Charlie wasn't afraid. He knew that whatever came next, he was ready. The city had been living in darkness for far too long. Tonight, that darkness was going to meet the light. And there was no turning back now. After a tense showdown and a dramatic chase, the ghost's empire crumbled like a house of cards in a storm. It wasn't quick or easy. Every step was fought for with blood, sweat, and sheer willpower. The night had stretched on endlessly, the air thick with adrenaline as Charlie and Effie relentlessly pushed forward, piece by piece, unraveling the dark network the ghost had spent years building. The chase had taken them through every shadowed alley, every hidden corner of Solace City, through places no sane person would dare to tread. But they'd done it. Together. Charlie had fought not only the ghost's men, but the city's apathy, its belief that darkness was inevitable. The longer they pursued, the more it became clear that this was more than just a case. It was a fight for the soul of the city itself. Every corner they turned revealed new layers of the ghost's operation. Human trafficking, drugs, corruption. All of it interconnected, a web spun so tight, so intricate, that no one had ever dared to tear it apart. Until now. They had watched the last of the ghost's cronies fall, the network crumbling under the relentless force of their pursuit. The people who had once been his followers were now being led away in handcuffs, their faces devoid of the confident arrogance that had once defined them. Effie had been the one to call it, the final blow, as she tracked the ghost to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The ghost, realizing his empire was crumbling, had tried to run, tried to escape. But the city had already started to turn against him. It was too late. When it was over, when the last of the ghost's power was snuffed out like a dying ember, the city felt different. The streets were quieter, the sky lighter. It was as if the weight that had been pressing down on Solace City for so long had finally been lifted. The endless night had receded, just a little, leaving behind a hint of dawn. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long golden streaks of light over the skyline. It felt like a new beginning, like the city was finally breathing again. Charlie and Effie stood on the rooftop, the cool morning air biting at their skin, the faint sounds of the city waking below. A new day had begun, and with it, the possibility of something better. Effie took a sip from her coffee, her eyes tracing the movement of the city below. She had always believed in the underdog, in those who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. But even she knew there was something different about this victory. It wasn't just about solving a case or taking down a criminal. It was about the city finding its voice again, about people realizing that they didn't have to live in fear. One case closed, Effie said, her voice still carrying the weight of the night, but now with a hint of satisfaction. She raised the cup in her hand, as though toasting the city itself. But it's just one battle in a war that's never really over. Charlie leaned against the railing, staring out over the city. The lines of tension in his face had softened just a little, the weight of the last few days lifting. But there was no celebration in his eyes. Not yet. He had seen too much, fought too hard to simply rest now. The city had changed, yes, but so had he. "It's never over," Charlie said, his voice low but steady. "As long as there's darkness, there will always be someone trying to drag the light down with them." Effie glanced at him, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You really do have a way of putting things, don't you?" Charlie smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone has to keep the story alive, Effie. Someone has to remember what it was like when it all fell apart." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of everything that had happened settle around them. The sun was higher now, casting warm light over the city, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was hope. Not just for Solace City, but for them too. The darkness had not been defeated, but it had been exposed. And as long as they were around, it would never be able to hide again. The city was waking up, and Charlie and Effie were already looking ahead. What came next would be a new challenge, a new case, but for now, they could breathe a little easier. They could savor the victory, however fleeting it might be, and know that they had made a difference. "Here's to the next one," Effie said, lifting her cup again, a playful glint in her eyes. Charlie nodded, his expression finally softening into something closer to a smile. "Here's to the next one." Charlie nodded, his gaze unwavering as he took in the sight of the city below, still waking up under the rising sun. The weight of the past few days, no, the weight of the past few years, felt a little lighter now, as if the world was shifting just a bit in the right direction. It wasn't victory that gave him this moment of clarity. It was something quieter, more elusive. Something deep inside him that had been buried under the endless grind of cases, shadows, and unanswered questions. A sense of peace, fleeting but real. "And 1,000 more waiting," Charlie said, his voice steady but tinged with a tired wisdom that spoke of endless nights and battles fought in the dark corners of the city. "But for now, Laura can rest. And maybe, just maybe, this city can heal." His words lingered in the morning air, like a fragile promise. A promise that change could come, even in a place as broken as Solace City. Effie didn't respond immediately. She leaned back against the cool metal of the rooftop railing, letting the morning light play over her face, casting shadows in the lines around her eyes. For a moment, the world felt still, as if even the city itself was taking a breath, recovering from the chaos it had lived through. Effie's eyes softened, her usual sharp edge dulled by the quiet of the moment. "You're a good man, Charlie Bennett," she said, her voice soft, almost distant. "Even if you do brood too much." Charlie's lips twitched into a half-smile, a rare and fleeting expression. Effie's words were always wrapped in layers, half teasing, half truth. But this one, it was different. There was no mockery, no biting sarcasm. Just the simple truth, spoken with the kind of understanding that only someone who had been through the fire could share. Effie, with all her bravado and sharp edges, knew what Charlie had carried, the weight of his own internal battles. She knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, to sacrifice pieces of your soul for the sake of something you might never see fixed. Charlie turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if the words didn't quite match the man standing in front of her. "You don't know half of it, Effie." His voice was low, but there was an honesty in it that he didn't often let people see. "This city, it doesn't give you the luxury of peace. You don't get to rest until it's done, until the fight is over." Effie shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Maybe that's what makes you so good at it," she said, her voice carrying a rare gentleness. "You fight until the last damn breath, even when it feels like there's no winning. That's what people don't see. They think you're just a hard-nosed detective who gets the job done, but you've got something more. Something human." Charlie's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of something deeper. Something that wasn't easy for him to acknowledge, let alone express. "I don't have time for humanity, Effie," he said quietly. "Not when there are people like the ghost out there." Not when the city is filled with shadows and lies. There's no room for it. No room for softness. Effie's eyes met his, unwavering. That's where you're wrong, Charlie. You think pushing it all down is what makes you strong. But strength isn't about shutting everything out. It's about knowing when to let it in. She paused, the weight of her words sinking in. It's about finding the balance. You've got that. Even when you don't see it. Charlie stared out at the city, his mind heavy with the weight of their conversation. Effie's words had a way of piercing through his walls, catching him off guard in ways he hated to admit. Maybe it was because, deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent so much of his life pushing against the tide, trying to keep the darkness at bay, trying to shut out everything that threatened to crack the veneer of his own control. But here now, with the city starting to stir awake, there was something different. Something in the air that made him believe maybe, just maybe, he could find that balance. Maybe Laura's death wasn't the end of the line. Maybe it was the beginning of something else, something better. A chance for the city, and for him, to start healing. I don't know, Effie, Charlie said, his voice softer now, almost contemplative. Maybe there's a place for peace in this city after all. Maybe it's not too late. Effie didn't respond right away. Instead, she took another sip of her coffee, her expression unreadable for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lighter, as though she could see the change in him that he himself hadn't yet realized. Maybe, she said with a teasing smile, but I still think you brood too much. It doesn't suit you. Charlie chuckled, the sound rough and unpolished but real. You've got a point there, Effie, he admitted, his smirk returning. But I'll work on it. For you, and for Laura. Effie raised her cup in a mock toast. I'll hold you to that, Bennett. I'll hold you to that. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching as the city began to come to life below them. The sun was higher now, its light bathing the streets in a warm golden glow. The shadows of the night had receded, replaced by the possibilities of a new day. And maybe, just maybe, it was a new beginning for them both. Charlie smirked, tipping his hat with a casual flick of his wrist, the brim casting a shadow over his eyes. There was something almost imperceptible about the way he did it, like it wasn't just a gesture but a statement. A defiant reminder that, despite the shadows closing in, he was still standing, still fighting. A small act of rebellion against a world that seemed intent on swallowing him whole. Somebody's got to, he said, his voice gravelly yet smooth, carrying the weight of years spent in a city that was always on the edge of something dark. Always teetering on the brink of chaos, where silence was a luxury few could afford, and truth was a currency you couldn't always spend. But Charlie? He had always known where to find it, even in the most unlikely of places. Even when it was buried under layers of grime and deceit. Because, as he'd learned the hard way, when nobody else was willing to look, you had to keep your eyes open a little wider, dig a little deeper, and trust your instincts. And as the city stretched into a new day, the rain paused its whispers, if only for a little while. The grey clouds that had hung over Solace City for what felt like an eternity began to break apart, allowing slivers of pale sunlight to peek through, casting a soft glow over the rooftops below. The streets, slick with the remnants of last night's downpour, reflected the light like polished silver. For a brief moment, the air felt lighter, as though the city itself was taking a breath, catching its own reflection in the hazy morning light. The world was still waking up, groggy, unsettled, but with the promise of something more. Something better. Charlie could feel it, even as the hum of the city began to build once more around him. He wasn't one to place much faith in the idea of a fresh start, but there was a quiet optimism in the air that made him wonder. Maybe, just maybe, the city's broken pieces could be stitched back together. Maybe he wasn't the only one who still believed in the possibility of change, no matter how small. Effie took a step forward, breaking the brief silence between them. She seemed to catch the change in the atmosphere too, the way the city was shifting from the heaviness of the night into the subtle promise of the dawn. Her sharp eyes, ever watchful, softened for a moment as she looked out at the skyline. "Don't let it fool you, Charlie," she said, her voice tinged with both caution and quiet amusement. "The city's always got another storm brewing, waiting just around the corner." Charlie chuckled, a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the tension of the moment. He wasn't about to get swept away by fleeting optimism, but there was something about the way Effie had said it. Like she knew the city, just as he did, had a strange way of offering hope, only to snatch it away at the first sign of weakness. Still, he couldn't help but feel the tug of something different today. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the rain-soaked streets, or the fact that for once, the city felt just a little less suffocating. "Yeah, well, maybe today the storm will be a little quieter," Charlie replied, his smirk slipping into something that resembled a rare moment of peace. "And maybe tomorrow too." Effie raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical but unwilling to completely dismiss the thought. "I'll believe it when I see it." Charlie tipped his hat again, his eyes glinting with that familiar spark of determination. "You just might, Effie. You just might." And for the first time in a long time, as the sounds of the city began to rise again, Charlie felt a flicker of something akin to hope. Faint, fragile, but enough to keep him going. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the night still lingered, reminding him that change was never easy, never quick. But it was always possible. And as the sun pushed through the clouds, a new chapter seemed to unfold on the horizon, waiting for those who were willing to face it head-on. The streets were waking up, and so was he. And as the city stretched into a new day, the rain paused its whispers, if only for a little while.